Is CEO compensation out of control? Joining us for this week's Smith Business Close-Up is Michael Faulkender, Assistant Professor of Finance. Dr. Faulkender, thanks for being with us. And just how do companies decide what the top executives are making?
What they do is their compensation committee of the board of directors works with the internal human resources department of the firm to benchmark their pay against other firms with whom they compete for talent. And so the research that I've been looking at recently is getting further inside these compensation peer groups.
And the CEO, it would sound like, is not part of that process, but still there are ways that they influence it.
Absolutely. The CEO is not able to participate on the compensation committee of the board. In fact, it's supposed to entirely be outsiders to try to mitigate the influence that the CEO can have. But because they are board members that are on the compensation committee and the CEO does play a role in the selection of the board of directors, there is still an indirect effect that the CEO can have on the pay setting process.
Let me run a statistic by you. In 1980, the average CEO compensation was about 42 times what the average worker was paid. And as of a couple of years ago, that had gone up to 344 times the pay of the average worker. What changed? How did that happen?
I think there are a number of factors that have influenced it. One of the dominant factors has been that firms have become much larger and more complex over time as they've become more multinational in scope. The competition for top talent has required that they be more competitive with their pay practices, and there's a greater distinction between the average employee and the CEO. But it's also the case that that does not preclude the CEOs having an increased influence on the pay setting process. And so really the debate amongst policymakers and academicians has been the extent to which this is the natural outcome we would see given the greater complexity of publicly traded firms relative to the influence they have over the process.
This may be more of a political question than a finance question, but how do you feel about this? I mean, is this in the public interest? If the CEO of some company makes $10, $20 million, is that a negative somehow for the company, for the country, or not relevant?
It depends upon what they've done for their shareholders. So if in the process they've created much more value for their shareholders than, quite frankly, the next best CEO, then you could make the argument that that compensation package is warranted. Where you have concern is instances where there's not been performance to accompany those levels of pay. And because the CEO can influence the pay setting process, that's why we're interested in understanding the extent to which it's the result of a natural outcome of competition for top talent versus the extent to which CEOs have been able to influence the negotiations that go on between the firm and that top talent.
Is there much of a regulatory structure around this now? I know there's certain disclosure requirements, but has the government really made an effort to put a lid of some sort on some of the things that do appear to be excessive?
The primary step that policymakers took is that they did place limitations on salaries in the mid-90s. They capped salaries at $1 million for tax-deductible purposes. However, what you then saw is more of that compensation come in the form of bonuses and stock option grants as opposed to salary, effectively making the policy change irrelevant. Other than that, the primary mechanism has been through disclosure, because the argument is that shareholders, through the board of directors, have a mechanism to mitigate any excesses. Again, the concern, though, is that CEOs may play a role in influencing the board, and it's that tension between board members being responsive to shareholders versus board members being influenced by the CEO that makes this such an interesting area for analysis.
Where do you think this debate is headed? Does CEO compensation plateau, level off at some point? Does it even maybe shrink, or does this trend continue?
I think that the direction that I hope it moves into is not so much a focus on levels, but a focus on sensitivity to performance. And so again, I'd like to come back to that if compensation is the result of CEOs generating value for their shareholders that they otherwise would not have benefited from, then that CEO pay may very well be warranted. It's when the pay comes despite poor performance. And so as long as there's a relationship between strong performance and compensation, I think that shareholders and, quite frankly, policymakers should be less concerned about absolute levels of pay.
All right, Michael Faulkender joining us from the Robert H. Smith School of Business. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.